For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is Unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hello and welcome to this podcast on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet. The last 4 podcasts have now given a historical overview of Satan's dominion and kingdom in the 4 major empires of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. My last podcast discussed in detail the 4th dreadful beast from Daniel 7:7. In that same verse, we learned that the dreadful beast had 10 horns growing from its head, and I'm going to be talking about the symbolic meaning of these 10 horns today. For the nutshell version of this podcast, you can check out section 137 in my book that you can find on my website at unveilingjesuschrist.com. Now, if you've been listening to my last 4 podcasts, you already have a pretty good idea what the 10 horns represent on the dreadful beast. If you don't yet know, then you'll find yourself in the same position as Daniel when he first saw the image of the beast and the 10 horns and said in Daniel 7:19 through 20, I would know the truth of the 4th beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron and his nails of brass, which devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet, and of the 10 horns that were in his head. Close quote. Sometimes we may feel a little bit like Daniel when we wake up from having a strange dream, wondering and telling people, I just had the weirdest dream. The difference is his dream or night visions actually have great meaning. But the point is, even Daniel did not know the meaning of what the Lord showed him, and he had to ask the meaning, which is all too clear to us in the latter days, because he was seeing in the future what we can understand perfectly with historical hindsight today. The horns symbolically represent power, strength, and dominion. The same symbolism is used in both the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation by John the Apostle, as explained by Albert Barnes, saying, the horn is a symbol of power and is frequently so used as an emblem or symbol in Daniel and Revelation. It is used as a symbol because the great strength of horned animals is found there. So in Deuteronomy 33:17, his beauty shall be that of a young bull, and his horns shall be the horns of a rhinoceros. With these he shall push the people to the extremities of the land. Such are the 10,000s of Ephraim, such the thousands of Manasseh. In Zechariah 1:18, the 4 horns that are seen by the prophet are said to be the 4 great powers which had scattered and wasted the Jews. Close quote. The 4 horns in Zechariah 1:18 would be the 4 kingdoms of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, the same ones I've been talking about in my last 4 podcasts. The 10 horns emerge out of the 4th kingdom of the Roman Empire, and these are 10 in number as a symbolically significant number. The 10 horns symbolize wholeness and completeness of some greater part. It is a definite number representing an indefinite number. So for the general discussion of numerology, including the number 10, you can check out my podcast from October 29 of 2023. Kyle and Dillich described the symbolism of the 10 horns seen by Daniel, saying the number 10 comes into consideration only according to its symbolical meaning of comprehensive and definite totality. That the horns are on the head of the one beast signifies that the unfolding of its power in the 10 kingdoms is not a weakening of its power, but only its full display. Close quote. The unfolding of Roman power represented by the four horns we know to be the modern nations. We know this with historical hindsight that Daniel did not have. We also know this from analogous images from Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2, as discussed in the Bible Illustrator, which says the 10 horns and the 10 toes represent the 10 kingdoms into which the Roman Empire would be divided. And here, as elsewhere in Scripture, the definite number 10 seems to be used in an indefinite sense for a great many. Close quote. The 10 horns represent Satan's whole or complete power and dominion in the modern nations, represented symbolically by the number 10. What Daniel saw as 10 horns, Nephi described in 1 Nephi 14:11, saying, "And it came to pass that I looked and beheld the whore of all the earth, and she sat upon many waters, and she had dominion over all the earth, among all nations, kindreds, tongues, and peoples." Close quote. In other words, the 10 horns represent the complete power of Satan in all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people. Keep in mind, the 10 horns are not a snapshot at some specific time in history. You have to look at the image more as a reel on Facebook or Instagram. It's an unfolding symbol over hundreds of years that began with the fall of Rome in 476 AD, when the Slavic and Germanic nations began taking control. But eventually they ceded back their power to the religion of Rome, as described in this quote by B.H. Roberts, saying, "The barbarians came with arms in their hands and as conquerors, it is true, and in the closing years of the 5th century obtained an easy victory over the western division of the empire. But if Imperial Rome was vanquished, there arose above its ruins Papal Rome, in majesty little inferior to that possessed by Imperial Rome in her palmiest days. And in the course of time, the victorious barbarians bowed in as humble submission to the wand of the popes as their ancestors had to the eagle-mounted standard of the emperors." Close quote. The evolution of the modern nations was still in the works with the Reformation and fall of the Holy Roman Empire. Even today, we see borders and nations shifting. All these are incorporated into Daniel's vision of the 10 horns, representing the power and dominion of Satan in the modern era. Most theologians miss the distinction between the political kingdoms and Satan's power or his controlling influence in the political kingdoms. They say the dream of Nebuchadnezzar is essentially the same as or equal to Daniel's visions, meaning specifically they think that the 10 toes of iron and clay in Nebuchadnezzar's dream are the equivalent of the 10 horns seen in Daniel's vision in Daniel chapter 7. By way of reminder, Daniel 2:32 through 33 describes the dream, saying, "This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay." Close quote. B.H. Roberts confirms that these images represent political kingdoms, saying, "Instead of 4 great dominant political powers symbolized in the image which Nebuchadnezzar saw and which Daniel interpreted, there are 5. That is, the head of gold, which is the Babylonish kingdom, the chest and arms of silver, the Medo-Persian monarchy, the brazen belly and thighs, the Greco-Macedonian Empire, the legs of iron, Rome, and the 5th, the feet and toes mixed of iron and clay, the modern kingdoms and states of the world." Close quote. The Encyclopedia of Mormonism further elaborates and defines this imagery, saying, "The 2 legs of iron point to the Roman Empire, foreshadowing the division between Rome and Constantinople. The feet of the image, part of iron and part of clay, symbolize the European kingdoms that grew out of the dissolving Roman Empire beginning in the 5th century. Those kingdoms merged the culture of Rome with that of northern and eastern European tribes, hence the symbolic mixing of iron and clay." Close quote. This statement is very true, but the symbolism of the 10 iron and clay toes does not end with the nations of Europe that grow out of the Holy Roman Empire. The vision doesn't close with the 5th century and the fall of Rome. Remember that 1 Nephi 14:11 had a vision that was broad enough to include all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people. Stated another way, the 10 toes are not 10 specific kingdoms or nations in Europe. This interpretive theory has led theologians in diverse directions. For example, Adam Clarke identifies his list of 10 while acknowledging that others have a different 10 nations, saying, "There are different opinions concerning the 10 kings, or rather, which they were that constituted the division of the Roman Empire. They are reckoned thus: 1. The Roman Senate; 2. The Greeks in Ravenna; 3. The Lombards in Lombardy; 4. The Huns in Hungary; 5. The Alamans in Germany; 6. The Franks in France; 7. The Burgundians in Burgundy; 8. The Saracens in Africa and a part of Spain; 9. The Goths in other parts of Spain; and 10. The Saxons in Britain." Close quote. Well, we can compare that list against a very different list of Matthew Henry, who said, "The learned are not agreed concerning this anonymous beast. Some make it to be the Roman Empire, which, when it was in its glory, comprehended 10 kingdoms: Italy, France, Spain, Germany, Britain, Sarmatia, Pannonia, Asia, Greece, and Egypt, and then the little horn which rose by the fall of 3 other horns, they make to be the Turkish Empire, which rose in the room of Asia, Greece, and Egypt." Close quote. Roger Clausen weighed in on this in the April 1930 conference report, saying, "The Roman Empire was broken up into smaller kingdoms represented by the feet and toes of iron and clay, and as there were 10 toes on the image, we might well conclude the following 10 kingdoms stand to represent the toes: Italy, established in 496 AD, France in 753, England 853, Germany 806, Holland 922, Portugal 1138, Persia 1139, Austria-Hungary 1159, Spain 1171, Greece 1829 AD." Close quote. Obviously, all these interpretations disregard the scope of Nebuchadnezzar's dream that extends to the time of the second coming and the small stone cut out of the mountain without hands that destroys all other nations and political kingdoms, as described in Daniel 2:44 through 45, saying, "And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Forasmuch as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter." Close quote. The small stone described in the book of Daniel is the kingdom of God that was restored on the earth in 1830 as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It makes no sense that the stone at the time of the second coming would destroy only 10 European nations. That's why we don't connect the two. They're diverse in time by at least a millennium. We're talking about all political kingdoms represented by the 10 toes, the same as we're talking about the power and dominion of Satan in those 10 political kingdoms represented by the 10 horns in Daniel chapter 7. Hiram Andrus more closely describes the rise of the 10 kingdoms from not just Imperial Rome that fell in 476 AD, but from the Holy Roman Empire that rose from the fall of Rome and continued into the 1800s, saying, the French Revolution, which began in 1789, destroyed the last vestiges of the Holy Roman Empire, which had been formed in AD 800 from the Roman Empire in the West. The Holy Roman Empire became extinct officially in 1806 when Francis II, the last emperor, resigned the elective imperial crown of the empire for the hereditary crown of Austria. The Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire had come to an end in 1453 when Constantinople was captured by the Turks. Sometime before the beginning of the 19th century, the spirit of nationalism had been gaining strength in the world and had already expressed itself in the formation of several national states. After the demise of the Holy Roman Empire, the spirit of nationalism became a seething force dominating the world of the 19th century. By its influence, the modern national state system was brought fully into being. Close quote. This description correctly accounts for both Western and Eastern Europe as well as Asia and the changes that occurred into the 19th century. This worldwide force of nationalism that gave rise to the modern nations in all 7 continents of the world. So we're talking about the 10 horns of Satan's power and dominion worldwide, exactly as expressed by Nephi in 1 Nephi 14:10, that talks about all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people, and the power of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. Now, Daniel 7 states that 10 horns are the 10 kings that shall arise in Daniel 7:24. This seems to suggest that the 10 horns are 10 earthly kings over political kingdoms, which conflicts, of course, with my view that we're really talking about Satan's power within the 10 kingdoms. John the Revelator builds on the same imagery of 10 horns and 10 kings in Revelation 17:12, saying, "And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast." Close quote. Note how the 10 kings are equated with the 10 horns. That is, the political power is tied to the spiritual power of Satan. They receive their power from and with their connection to the beast that John describes in Revelation 13 that we'll get into in due course. The kings are the outward manifestation of Satan's power. You might say they are his instruments. They are under his influence and they do his bidding. Bruce R. McConkie connects the two with other symbolism found in John's Revelation, where earthly kings and kingdoms are said to fornicate with the great whore of false religion and Satan's influence, saying, as the angel in Revelation 17:2 has already intoned, the kings of the earth have committed fornication with the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. Now, in the hidden and half-understood imagery in which the whole concept is couched, the angel speaks of 10 kings, symbolical, as we suppose, of all the kings of the earth. Close quote. Thus, the 10 kings are symbolical of all kings of the earth, and not just the 10 modern nations of Europe, but all these kings and kingdoms, politically speaking, are under the control and influence of Satan as depicted by the great whore, and as depicted in Daniel as the 11 horns, including 10 that are found in the modern nations and the one little horn that I'll be discussing in my next podcast. Furthermore, Satan is a king in a kingly sense over his spiritual dominions embodied by the great whore. Remember Revelation chapter 9:11, where it was said that the unembodied and disembodied spirits have a king over them, saying, quote, "They had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon." Close quote. So if you want to find out more about Satan as the king of the bottomless pit, you can go back and check out my podcast from January 19 of 2025. The bottom line is Satan is a king, and his influence is part of the fabric of the 10 earthly kings. Hugh Nibley describes his role in the modern nations, that is Satan's role, saying, "Satan will take the resources of the earth, and with precious metals as a medium of exchange, he will buy up military and naval might, or rather those who control it, and so will govern the earth, for he is the prince of this world. He does rule. He is king." Close quote. Satan truly is a king, and his agents are at work on the kings, politically speaking, in the modern nations. They have great power to influence and blind mortal heads of state. J. Perry connects some of the symbols behind the power we see exhibited today in world leaders, saying, "Satan is found in many places, and he rules over many nations, represented by the 7 crowns on 7 heads. Horns are a symbol of power. The number 10 suggests that Satan has great power, but it is neither perfect nor complete. Such a complete power, represented by 12 horns, resides in the Lamb. Yet the 7 crowns indicate that Satan has perfect and complete power on earth, at least for a time." Close quote. Bruce R. McConkie further describes Satan's power over men, including those specifically that control nations and the armies of nations, saying, "Satan is king. He rules in the heart of men. He commands the armies of mortal men who wage these wicked wars among themselves." Close quote. For all these reasons, the 10 horns of power represent Satan's dominion and his influence in the modern nations, not the nations themselves. Paul expressed the same principle very well when he said in Ephesians 6:12 that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Close quote. Warren Wiersbe, a non-LDS theologian and author, said it perfectly, saying, "The 10 horns, these represent 10 kings or kingdoms that will exist in the last days. Daniel wrote in language the people of his day could understand, and the concept of nations as we have them today would be foreign to the ancients. In Daniel's day, countries were ruled by kings, but the kingdoms spoken of here will be nations as we know them." Close quote. The 10 horns on the head of the dreadful Roman beast are an extension of Satan's power and dominion from the Roman kingdom, as discussed in my last podcast. Since the 4th dreadful beast represented Satan's power in the Roman Empire, the 10 horns must represent Satan's power in kingdoms that emerge from the Roman Empire. This is true because 10 horns are an obvious outgrowth on the head of the 4th beast. Albert Barnes described the connectedness of these symbolic images, saying, "There were to be 10 kings that would arise or spring out of that kingdom at some period of its history. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise. That is, not that the kingdom itself would spring out of the 10 others that would be amalgamated or consolidated into one, but that out of that one kingdom there would spring up 10 that would exercise dominion, or in which the power of the one kingdom would be ultimately lodged. Though Daniel appears to have seen these horns as pertaining to the beast when he first saw them, yet the subsequent explanation is that these horns were emblems of the manner in which the power of that one kingdom would be finally exerted, or that 10 kings or dynasties would spring out of it." Close quote. Warren Wiersbe expressed the same view with fewer words, saying, "It is out of this confederation of 10 nations, which in some way is an extension of the Roman Empire, that the Antichrist will come and the final world kingdom will be organized and actively oppose God and his people. The 4 kingdoms represented by the 4 beasts have already come and gone. However, verse 12 indicates that each kingdom continues to exist in some way within the succeeding kingdom that it devoured." Close quote. Now, as I've mentioned before, the political kingdoms continue to become more and more inferior from one to the next, while the dominion and power of Satan in each of these 4 kingdoms continues to grow and become stronger as it goes forward. Thus, we may also conclude that with regard to the 10 horns, Satan's power represented by the 10 horns is stronger in the modern nations than it even was during the time of the Roman Empire. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times the Holy Roman Empire without really explaining what that means or the important role that it has in Daniel's vision. And frankly, I'm going to get into more detail about the Holy Roman Empire in my next podcast. But by way of summary, if you will, or introduction, from the last podcast, we should have a pretty good handle on the Roman Empire from the time it conquered the Greek Empire in about 130 BC until the fall of Rome in 576 AD. At the time that Rome fell, it was known as an imperial power. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when Rome actually first came to power, it was actually a republican form of government where people had a voice, albeit a small voice, in the affairs of the government. But in 27 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated, and this brought an end to the republican form of government, and the government became imperial. That is, a single emperor with almost complete autonomy and control. So from 27 BC, when Caesar was assassinated, until 476 AD, we have the period of the Imperial Roman Empire. And 476 is when we have the fall of Rome to the tribes from the north. This is described by Franklin D. Richards, saying, "The Roman Empire was finally crushed by barbarian hordes. They desolated whole provinces, leaving only remnants of corrupt peoples to be measurably regenerated by an infusion of new blood from the plains of Eastern Europe and Western Asia. Modern nations have risen from its ashes, have adopted its religion, its customs, its ethics, without inspiration from heaven, without any further gospel dispensation, without apostles and prophets of the house of Israel, and without the guidance of the holy priesthood." Close quote. After the fall of Rome and the fall of the Imperial Roman Kingdom, we have the rise of what historians call the Holy Roman Empire. Now, that same event is sometimes called the fall of pagan Rome and the rise of papal Rome. For example, B.H. Roberts drew such a distinction and connection, saying, "That which was at first granted to the Church as a privilege was soon demanded as a right, and what was at first received by grace was at the last taken by force. On the ruins of pagan Rome rose papal Rome, and while the latter power did not abolish secular government, it did make it subservient to ecclesiasticism. From the chair of St. Peter, the Roman pontiffs ruled the world absolutely. Kings and emperors obeyed them, and all stood in awe before the throne of the triple-crowned successor of St. Peter." Close quote. Now, technically speaking, the rise and fall of Imperial Rome and the Holy Roman Empire does not coincide with the rise and fall of pagan Rome or Papal Rome. Imperial Rome fell in 476 AD, but the rise of the Holy Roman Empire wasn't official until 800 AD, when Charlemagne was crowned emperor by one of the popes of Rome. So pagan Rome died with Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 AD. Later emperors outlawed paganism, and Christianity was enforced by edict and with the sword. This was all long before the power was vested in the papacy in 800 AD. So that's how we get from Imperial Rome to the Holy Roman Empire in a nutshell, and I'm going to talk about it some more in future podcasts. But this is sufficient to get us from the dreadful fourth Roman beast to the 10 horns on the head, representing Satan's power in the modern nations. These 10 horns began to grow when Imperial Rome fell, but they did not exist in their modern form until after the fall of the Holy Roman Empire in the early 1800s. Until then, we have the power of Rome continuing through the Dark Ages. B.H. Roberts spoke of this period of Roman domination and the form of that dominion and domination, saying, "I have already spoken of the world's age of darkness, usually regarded as extending from the close of the 10th to the opening of the 16th century. That was the midnight period of our world truly. The papal power was generally supreme and ruled the nations with an iron hand. By the opening of the 16th century, however, and this by the operation of forces presently to be noted, many of the temporal kings and princes of Europe, especially of Northern Europe, were jealous of the power exercised within their dominions by the Roman pontiffs, as it lowered the dignity of their own position." Close quote. To say that the papal power was supreme and ruled the nations means that the popes in this period largely controlled the power of monarchs and political heads of state. That's the spiritual and political context from which the modern nations emerged, including Satan's power and dominion in the modern nations. Today, Satan's power is growing in the modern nations. In other words, Satan's power in the modern nations is greater than his power in the Roman Empire, and that would be both Imperial Rome and the Holy Roman Empire. His power that he has today and that he continues to use today will devour the whole earth and tread it down and break it in pieces, as we're told in Daniel 7:23. Albert Barnes explains the meaning of this verse, saying, "There can be no doubt as to the general meaning of the fourth beast, for it is explained in Daniel 7:23 as denoting a kingdom that should devour the whole earth and tread it down and break it in pieces. As a symbol, it would denote some power much more fearful and much more to be dreaded, having a wider dominion and more stern, more oppressive in its character, more severe in its exactions, and more entirely destroying the liberty of others, advancing more by power and terror and less by art and cunning than either. This characteristic is manifest throughout the symbol." Close quote. So the only omission from this quote that I would observe is the latter-day meaning associated with the 10 horns in the modern nations of the world. We live in the day when Satan's power has expanded and grown. And you may be wondering how the power of Satan could be worse today than, for example, in 70 AD when 1.1 million Jews were killed, or during the Dark Ages when people lived their entire lives in spiritual darkness and temporal bondage to kings and overlords. If you look at your circumstances today and modern society, it seems like conditions have much improved and that Satan's power is actually waning. That question brings us to the subject of my next podcast, where I will talk about the one horn in Daniel's vision that emerges from the 10 horns and uproots 3 of the 10, as discussed in Daniel chapter 7, verse 8. So, until next time, thanks for watching, listening, sharing, and subscribing, and to Jenna and Kristen for all their technical help. I'll see you next time on Unveiling Jesus Christ.